All right. Good evening and welcome. We're so glad you're here for the second interview in our fall series with Grandparents for Public Schools. Tonight's session is being recorded, so feel free to share it with your friends. They'll appreciate it. We're in for a real treat tonight. We have the privilege of interviewing two top advocates for public education, journalist Jennifer Berkshire and education scholar Jack Schneider. They bring incredible insights and have seen it all when it comes to the challenges our schools face. Jennifer writes about education and politics for leading publications like The Nation and the New York Times, and she hosts the fantastic podcast, or co-hosts the fantastic podcast, my personal favorite education podcast, Have You Heard? She's also a teacher and an author of 3 books, including A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, co-written with Jack. And Jack Schneider here is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an expert on how history, culture, and rhetoric shape education policy. He's written the 5 books and contributes to major outlets like The Atlantic and the Washington Post, also the New York Times, and co-hosts with Jennifer, Have You Heard? Podcast. So why does all this matter? Jennifer and Jack's new book, Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual, tackles the big fights happening in education right now. This is more than just about policy. It's about the survival of public education. Oh, we may need to mute some people. It's about
Did you take a video of it?
Yeah, well, it took Carrie and Jason
Robert.
to figure out how to do this thing.
Oh, okay.
And Jace finally, I said, here.
We are
She's
grandparents
young.
here.
Yeah.
You know, I haven't had a wreck since
Oh, goodness.
2017.
Guys, could you all
Yay.
mute your
Speaking
audio?
of cars, though.
Can
you're
you
still-
can you mute her?
Yeah, I've told him before.
Can you go
Yeah,
to
please,
the
so it's a field trip, $250.
the people
Oh.
and
Oh,
this
okay,
is
so
this is
hang
fun.
on.
This is
And
there's,
grandparents for
flat
public
real.
schools.
Now
again.
it's only 10,000.
And we're excited that everybody's here. So so why does this matter? Jennifer and Jack's new book, Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual, tackles the big fights happening in education right now. This is more than just about policy. It's about the survival of public education and democracy itself. That's why tonight's discussion is so important for parents and grandparents in Texas and beyond. So let's dive in and get started here. Jennifer, I guess you guys can tell which one is Jennifer and which one's Jack. Quite frankly, it makes me really happy that smart people are helping. Texas public schools are in a lonely place right now. And just when we think we have to save ourselves, your book comes out. So it couldn't be better timing. I'd like to ask you about is, I guess I didn't introduce myself, it doesn't matter. I'm part of Grandparents for Texas Public Schools. My name is Tracy Fisher, and it's my turn to do the interview. So you're stuck with me. Tell us about what's happening in public schools, the public schools we know and love, and why is it happening everywhere?
So I'm actually going to have Jack go first because Jack, one little thing you might have missed in his fancy description is that Jack is an education historian, and that turns out to be such a useful body of knowledge right now because we can ask him to look back over the decades and tell us, is what we're looking at right now different than in the past? So Jack, what do you say?
The answer is, as is so often the case, no and yes. So we have been here before. Americans have been fighting over their public schools since the very first taxpayer-supported open enrollment schools opened their doors. And there's a lot to fight about, right? Because in public education, we're not just shaping the present, we're shaping the future. We're making decisions about the kinds of communities we want to live in because we're making decisions about the kinds of values, skills, dispositions, beliefs, habits of mind we want young people to acquire today so that when they become leaders tomorrow, they can enact the kind of society that we would like to become. And we don't agree with each other on everything in this country. And in fact, that's okay. But it does mean that from time to time, school politics boil over. And so we've seen this historically. I'll just talk about the 20th century briefly, where we had two Red Scares. There were a number of scares around, secular humanism or teachers' sexual identities that were rooted in religious and moral value disagreements. The two Red Scares led to, hundreds or thousands of teachers losing their jobs because they had been branded Marxists or communists, and led to constraining of educator autonomy in terms of what was being taught. We've fought over the teaching of evolution. So the fighting is not new. What is different this time is that the fighting historically always presumed that the public education system itself would continue to exist. The fight was over what the public schools should look like, what should be taught, who should be teaching, and what kinds of young people should be coming out of the public education system. What's different today is not that we're fighting, but rather that there is a dedicated core of ideologues who would very much like to see the end of public education. And this has been true for well over half a century. It's just that this idea of eliminating public schools has never been popular. So we can go back to Milton Friedman in the mid-20th century, who came up with the idea of private school vouchers. And the only takers were far-right market ideologues. So we're not talking about your ordinary Republicans. So these would have been people like, who had voted for Dwight Eisenhower, right? They were not attracted to the idea of private school vouchers. But then we get a bit of a shift when Barry Goldwater runs for president and introduces some of this free market thinking into the ideological ecosystem of the right. And still, most Americans, left, right, and center, have no interest in private school vouchers. And this is true when Ronald Reagan is president. Ronald Reagan, who actually himself was an advocate of private school vouchers, realized pretty quickly when he became president that the American people were not interested in a voucher plan, and he moved on to other projects. And so this ideological core of market-oriented thinkers who believe that public schools are too expensive, they don't like the idea that they are open access, and they certainly don't like the idea that they serve everybody equally, have been laying the groundwork for a long time to try to pull apart the public education system. And they happen to be using the current culture war, which is not particularly different from any of the other culture wars we've had in the past. They flare up every couple of decades. They're using this current culture war as a way of prying people's sympathies toward public education away from the schools, and using the moment to try to convince people that this project of public education is no longer worth the trouble. Now, Jennifer and I happen to think it very much is worth the trouble, that learning to live alongside each other across our disagreements is an essential part of living in a diverse democracy. And having to hash out what we want our schools to do and how we want them to educate the young people who will be leading this country is a core part of a functioning democracy. And if we wash our hands of that and say, you know what, let's all go our separate ways. Let's all educate our children as we want, according to whatever ideology we believe in, that we will further fracture as a nation at a time when we're already feeling, many of us, like we're coming apart, at a time when what we need is actually to be coming together to figure out how to work across our differences. And so I think what's so important to know now is that we've been here before, but we haven't been here at a time or in a moment when people have been trying to exploit these differences in order to drive forward an agenda that most Americans find really unpalatable.
Wow. That's so interesting. So, a lot of people say, well, COVID was kind of the undoing of it all. It really drove a bigger wedge and some questions as parents sat in Zoom calls with their kids' teachers, seeing, what was happening in a classroom when that wasn't even a real classroom example because nobody knew what they were really doing or trying to do in those cases. I mean, was that an opportunity that they took or leveraged onto, or how did that play into it?
Well, so if you think about that story, it never quite added up.
Yeah.
Because why would it be that the same parents who were so angry about what they saw on Zoom in their child's online schoolroom would be the loudest voices in favor of reopening schools? And then why would the policy agenda that came out of that be an insistence that taxpayers start paying the private school tuition for people who were never in the public schools, right? You can kind of see the cracks in the story that's being told. But you're right that if it's the amount, the pandemic was awful for everybody, but for parents of school age kids in particular. And there really was, like it was profoundly dislocating, and there was a lot of unhappiness about everything related to it, whether it was school closures or COVID mitigation. And so you saw coalitions of parents forming around this. And then what happened, like as that started to fade away, they started to pivot to other issues, more extreme issues that didn't have anywhere near the same kind of public resonance. And so I'll give you a classic example. So there was a lot of energy in school boards in Florida around protests against mask mandates. Well, then Governor Ron DeSantis ends up banning district level mask mandates. And so on a dime, parent activists switched to banning books. And you can see how like the coalition in favor of pulling books off the shelves is much smaller than parents who are just really unhappy about the way their district is responding to COVID. And so I think that it's the unhappiness of parents has been a convenient story to tell. But the easiest measure we have of whether it's accurate or not is to look at how candidates have fared when they've run on a campaign of parents' rights. And for all the talk, they've done really poorly. The candidates, and I apologize, I live on a train track and there's a train rumbling by. People are always surprised when I tell them that the candidates who are allied with Moms for Liberty and similar groups lose around 3/4 of the time. And when we see the same thing for state level candidates, that this particular, a narrow definition of parents' rights that revolves around anger, book banning, an obsession with bathrooms has turned out to be really, really unpopular with voters. And so I think it kind of shows you the disconnect between the story we've heard so often and how people continue to experience it. So that's a big part of the reason why I'm actually quite positive about where we are right now.
Yeah, that's hopeful. I'm thinking about Texas. It's mentioned a few places in your book. Do you see anything different from Texas and this fight here versus out there? Are we further behind? I mean, we are the birthplace of standardized testing. Maybe we're holding on to that a little hard. We talk about government schools all the time. I know it's the same, parents' rights, it's all the same stuff. Bible stories now that they're looking at K-5 curriculum here. And I noticed on Monday, they didn't say ESAs on the agenda for the Education Commission or education hearing, public ed hearing at the House. They said educational opportunities. Like they are continuing to change the name. So talk about Texas a little bit. Any thoughts about?
So I'll start, and then Jack, maybe you can add on something about standardized testing.
Sure.
You know, people are really interested in that. But I would say that in many ways, Texas is taking all of the worst trends that are out there and then supersizing them.
Mhm.
And when I go around and give talks, I'll always put up a slide to try to give a visual of what strange bedfellows are in this kind of anti-public education coalition. And so I'll have like a cat on top of a donkey just to show how, and that's, I feel like that's such a big part of the story in Texas, all of the different forces that have allied in this moment. And so so you have, for example, your fabulously rich oil men, right, who would like to see Christian alternatives to all of your public institutions, not just K-12 schools, but higher ed and even vocational schools.
Mhm.
You've got your libertarian folks at the Policy Institute. So you've got this political mashup going on. And then I think, you know, there is the vast majority of kids in Texas go to the public schools. And so as much energy as there is right now from Governor Abbott and his allies around trying to nudge particularly middle class and more affluent families out of the public schools and into private religious schools, the reality is that that's where the vast majority of kids are in Texas and where they will remain. And so you're seeing the same kind of the policy levers in Texas that have been so focused on standardized testing now moving in this more conservative religious direction. Like, what if we could just put different materials in front of the kids? Maybe then we'll keep them from growing up to be leftists.
Yeah,
devoted.
and one of the challenges is that, you know, in a two-party system, you might think that the opposition to those seeking to undermine public education and you know, drive parents and families into private schools supported by vouchers, you might think that the opposition would make a full-throated defense of public education. And Jennifer mentioned standardized testing. And what you see in places like Houston, for instance, is a doubling down on the neoliberal order that was in place from the time of George H.W. Bush's presidency through the end of the Obama administration. And that has only allowed opponents of public education to make an even stronger case against public schools, that public schools are too focused on a narrow curriculum, are totally disengaged from the work of educating young people around values, that public schools are bureaucratic in nature, and that they're evaluated by out-of-touch elites. You know, a lot of those critiques are true. And one of the things that we ought to be doing as advocates of public schools is not simply pushing back against some of the more radical and outrageous proposals that we're seeing from the political right, but also pushing back against the political left, as they would style themselves, although the policies that they have been advocating for in education really were bipartisan for a couple of decades there, and demanding the sorts of things that actually serve young people and communities better, and narrowing the curriculum such that particularly our disadvantaged students are getting double doses of test prep in English language arts and mathematics, and getting less history and science, to say nothing about subjects like, you know, civics education, or even, you know, things that every young person should be entitled to, right? Arts and music education. And if we're really thinking deeply about this, you know, let's think not just about the narrowing of the curriculum, but also about student engagement and student commitment to school and student sense of the value of learning, right? That all of those things matter tremendously, and they matter tremendously for us as well as grandparents, but for us as citizens, right? We all have a stake in the public schools. That's why we fund them with our tax dollars, right? So when the far right is making a case that the money should quote unquote follow the child, what they're essentially saying is public schools only serve a child and that child's immediate family, right? Their parents or guardians. And that simply isn't the case. We've always funded public schools in this country with our tax dollars because we are all affected by the work that happens in public education. And so we all need to be advocating for public schools that advance the full mission of public education. And so really it's important to remember that fault lies with both political parties right now, which is not to say that every leader within both parties is completely tone deaf with regard to what we ought to be doing in public education. But it does mean they need to be hearing more from people like you about why you value public education, what you think public schools are there to do, and the fact that you are going to remain active in putting pressure on them to fulfill their obligations, right? The vast majority of state constitutions have obligations to young people to educate them, and Texas is no exception.
Right. The thing, I think on my postcards I was writing last week, I talked about Article 7 of our state constitution. It doesn't say we need to pay for parents to have lots of choices. It says we will provide a free and efficient education for all children. And it's like we there's a lot of pushback now on charter schools. Charter schools, we've got $2 billion a year are being spent on charter schools now in Texas. We have over 1,000 charter schools. And you would think if choice was the answer, we would have been way down the road in making everything better in Texas because we've got all these charter school choices, plus all the things that public schools have done to compete with that, jumping through hoops. It's so, as you said, Jennifer, it's so the cracks in the story. I mean, it's just all over the place. And now they just kind of, facts are facts, and they just keep screaming the facts. But I appreciate that. From when I was a parent and not a grandparent, what I was most interested in was, had school changed a whole lot since I was in school? And I found that I didn't think it did so much because that was the beginning of the testing and our kids were being prepped in first grade for a third grade test. And so, we made some choices, but when we came back to our school district, it was amazing. They had a new leader. And that leader was all about what you were talking about. What we need to be doing is making sure that this education is valuable to the current times we live in. And it is preparing kids for their future right now, because nothing else will except for fumbling along. So we're proposing, we're doing this old school thing that makes sure reading, writing, arithmetic, when that isn't necessarily the most important thing that parents or communities or teachers or kids even need or want. Academics are important and being exposed to a lot, but we need to make sure our schools are keeping up with the world, and we're not shoving them back into a place that it's not helping them be prepared for their school, for their lives and their current state. Okay, I'm just kind of rambling now. So, okay, so you have talked about some really great things, the standardized tests, all the stuff, all the monkey business, all the culture war stuff. And we know, you just know, it's like when they say it, you're like, what? I mean, that doesn't even make any sense. So the thing I love about your book, and let me just show everybody this book. If you haven't seen it, it's Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider here. It's only 56 pages. It's a very easy book. And where will it fit? How do you carry this book, Jack? How do you carry it?
Mute there. Yeah, you can carry it in a fanny pack.
Oh my gosh, that's so nice.
Or if you've got big back pockets. I grew up in the 1980s, and By the early 90s, it was very fashionable to be wearing jeans that were about 18 sizes too big. If you've got a pair of jeans like that, I bet it's got a big pocket you could
Yeah.
fit this slim little book into. I did promise Lynn the next time I unmuted, I would define neoliberal. Neoliberal, without getting into a whole academic discourse around it, just means the idea that government should operate more like the free market. So it's incorporating business ideas into the operation of government and public policy. And so a perfect example of that would be the use of standardized tests to hold schools accountable for results. So that's a quote unquote performance management scheme that comes directly out of business literature from the 1970s. And the idea is, that government really ought to sort of step out of the way and stop trying to tell schools what to do. They should instead establish a threshold for performance that schools must meet. And if they don't meet that, then they'll meet the fate of every underperforming employee and they'll be sacked. And this kind of neoliberal idea was attractive to both Republicans and Democrats in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly in education. And so you tended to not be able to tell the difference, at least at the federal level, between Republicans and Democrats on the matter of education for about 25 years. So if you go back and you look at the things that George W. Bush was saying about education, they didn't differ that much from what Barack Obama was saying about education, despite some major differences in ideology and policy on other issues. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about neoliberalism. And when we talk about a kind of neoliberal consensus, we're talking about an agreement, essentially, that led to the quarter century of promotion of charter schools, promotion of standardized testing, ignoring the conditions that students live in that shape so much of what happens in schools, refusing to invest further in schools or in communities, and instead believing that what we needed to do was wring a little bit more blood out of the stone.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've got, I mean, here in Texas, we've got Democrat state reps who are very supportive of charter schools and state board members, very supportive. And we've got, of course, we've got our voucher folks on the other end of that spectrum. But I think that's still, those pieces are still out there. So as people vote in the upcoming election, they need to be paying attention to all the things on that website promoting that person, and not just, some things. So, okay, the brilliance about this wonderful book that you can easily carry and get through really quickly because it's awesome, is that it doesn't just tell us what's going wrong with the world and some things in Texas too, but it also offers a couple things. One is it offers some smart, intelligent historian kind of writers, people that know what they're doing and they've studied this, their little inserts that talk about why some of this stuff is happening and what will happen if it continues. But they also have these expert people around the country that have figured out how to fight back during these culture wars and during these times, and it's state by state, and we need some help here in Texas. So who might we look to, and give us some examples of the things that we can do, we can impact.
So back in 2020, when this stuff really erupted, and we started seeing all the dramatic footage of people yelling at school board races, it really didn't matter where you were. I think a lot of people were really caught off guard by that. And didn't know how to respond. But then, something really interesting happened, which was that they pretty quickly figured out how to respond. And so whether it was New Hampshire, which is just over the border from us, or Wisconsin or North Carolina, you started to see groups coming together in these communities And because the threats being directed both at vulnerable students, but also at the very idea of public schools, because people, I think, really understood that they were dealing with something very serious, the organizing started to attract groups that hadn't traditionally seen themselves as being part of public education advocacy. So it might be gay and lesbian rights groups, it might be citizens groups, voting rights groups. And then I think one really key thing that we doesn't get enough attention is that because those groups are really outside of the world of public education, it turned out to be much easier for them to make the kind of stirring case for why we need public schools than the people who work in that world, the teachers, the administrators, because any of you who've spent time in what I think of fondly as edu-world know that it can often be a place where there is a lot of jargon and and it's frustrating because what they do is so important, but they're not always the best at explaining it in a way that ordinary people can understand. And you see this trend across history that they'll then be disparaged by politicians and critics of public education who call them educationists. And so I think part of the reason that we've seen this successful organizing at the school board level and beyond is because you have all these folks now who are out there making the case that if we lose public schools, they're not coming back, and just how essential the institution is in terms of democracy. And Jack, I don't know if you have something that you want to add.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Jennifer and I talk about is the importance of building untraditional coalitions, that public schools are something that actually the vast majority of Americans across age, across sex and gender, across race, across income brackets, across region, across urbanicity support. And that's particularly important these days when we disagree about so much, and those disagreements often cleave along the same lines. And so I think Jennifer and I both tend to make the case to people that it's not just that building these kinds of cross-racial, cross-generational, cross-class coalitions are more powerful for supporting education, but that actually they can do something else as well, and that's begin to heal America with regard to the divisions that have made us so deeply distrust each other that if you disagree with anybody, that you immediately dismiss not just their opinion, but the entire basis of fact upon which their views are grounded. And, we've seen some really great coalitions. I mention this because you are grandparents, bringing people of different generations together. And often it's been students who lead the work. And so seeing folks who themselves have the kind of wisdom and experience that you all have stand side by side with students who often are equally dismissed because the conversation tends to focus around parents, when in fact grandparents have every bit as much skin in the game here as parents do. And nobody's got more skin in the game than students. And so I think there's a lot of power there in folks across different generations coming together, again, not just for the purpose of making a stronger argument, which you will do, because it will emphasize just how deeply important public schools are to our communities, and that they aren't just a kind of service for parents that we offer in this country, but will also lay the groundwork for, maybe it's political organizing, but maybe it's something far more basic, which is just relearning how to talk to each other and how to engage in, a kind of civic friendship, which we have so few opportunities to practice in this country.
Yeah, amen to that, I tell you, I guess. It's, yeah, so, does anybody, I'm looking at the chat, nobody has been, except for, thank you, Lynn, for asking about neoliberal. Are there any questions from the audience that anybody is really desperately, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. It's Shannon?
And yeah, I'm going to jump right in. and
Okay,
say-
Amy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Amy.
I would like to get your take on whether you think this effort basically to dislodge public schools to make them, seem like there's everything wrong with them is part of a larger effort to privatize pretty much everything that our government now provides as a public service, the post office, all of these things. Do you see that as fitting into a larger effort?
We're both nodding vigorously, but I happen to be unmuted, so I'll kick off a response. Yes, absolutely. One of the first things that you have to do if you want to get people to turn their backs on a cherished institution is convince them that it has gone off the rails. So, you absolutely see that right now in public education, but as you noted, Amy, you see that in other walks of life, where a privatization effort tends to get off the ground by first making the case that doing something as a public for the public good with full public funding is a recipe for disaster. And the more that you can make that argument to people, the less that you actually have to do to convince them about particular cases, because they will just begin to assume that anything that we do with public funds, anything that is open to all, is inherently going to fail. And so we've seen this with healthcare in this country. As you noted, we've seen it with the post office, and of course, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yes, mail delivery has gotten worse. And why is that? It's because of divestment from the post office and the insistence that the post office ought to be profitable rather than actually provide fair and equal service to everybody. And so public education is the thing that we do in this country that is most public, because it serves the greatest number of people for the largest amount of time. You've got 50 million young people who are enrolled in public schools who attend on average for 180 days a year for about 12 years. And annually, we spend the better part of $1 trillion on it if you add together local, state, and federal expenditures. It is the most public thing we do. And if you can convince people that public education has gone wrong, then that will have spillover effects to every other part of public life, which already has been under assault for the past several decades.
That's a great question, Amy. Think about
Okay.
Yes, Shannon.
Okay. We often evaluate schools and school districts by the results of standardized tests. And is that being calculated into whether public schools or private schools are better? We have a state mandated core curriculum. Are private schools immune from that? And they are immune from that? I see you shaking your head.
Yes.
Okay, well, who establishes this state mandated core curriculum? And do we ever compare standardized tests from private schools to those in public schools? And is there evidence to show that the private schools are doing better?
I'm happy to start an answer to this, although everybody froze a minute ago for me. So if I freeze, the problem is me and my internet, and I apologize in advance. So tests are mandated in America's public schools. They tend to never be given in private schools because they have nothing to gain and everything to lose by making themselves comparable to public schools. However, we do see comparable scores, and then we can pull for out-of-school access to opportunity. So, for instance, you control for family income, you control for parental educational attainment, such that you are engaging in a fair apples-to-apples comparison, right? You're not comparing very affluent kids whose parents both possess graduate degree, kids living in poverty, family, different language at home, and all of that is going to child's ability, their intelligence on a standardized test.
Jack, you're
But instead, you're
frozen.
controlling for those demographic variables in your comparison. Rose.
Yeah, maybe you want to try doing it with your audio off.
Oh.
I mean, not your
No.
audio off, your video off. Your video off.
No.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, that was good. Well, he'll come back maybe. There he
Oh,
is.
there he is.
He's just moving around on us,
Uh-huh.
seeing if we're awake.
Am I
Are you there?
frozen
Can-
again?
Yeah,
think-
you
yeah.
froze.
Well, you're breaking up.
Yeah. I see you moving now. Okay.
Well, while Jack figures out his audio situation, I would just add to that one of the things we're seeing in all the states, including Texas, that have either enacted these sweeping voucher programs or have expanded existing programs or are creating new ones, is that the programs by design make it difficult or impossible for you to track how kids who move to the private schools or are already attending private schools do. And so that's a good indication there that there's something else going on here besides just, your policymakers and policy elites and lawmakers wanting kids to attend quote unquote better schools. They're actually making it almost impossible for you to see how kids in private schools do, even though you're going to be paying for it. Right. And when you think about the arguments that have been made about standardized testing in Texas, which is really unpopular, right? They argue that it's absolutely necessary in order to make sure that you're getting something for your investment.
I recently, I guess today, well, yesterday, on Monday during that Education Commission meeting, a local or Travis County judge, I believe, is the one that stopped the A through F rating to go, from going out across the state, because the test is a problem. I mean, we know it is. They are using AI to grade writing samples and they're giving kids zeros. And it isn't everywhere, but it particularly is hurting. And they show, well, anyway, so they also use for TELPAS for our English learners, they are, they're not in a situation where they can get better because of the way it's being scored. They used to be scored by a teacher who could hear them talk and could talk back to them and they could have a conversation. When you're listening with AI, you don't know. And so they're unfairly, particularly being hurt by our standardized test. And then they get caught up in a testing regime where they have to retake that test. And, I mean, we have kids that just, for whatever reason, I mean, they're having then to go on ahead in their learning, but they have to go back to finish this test, and it's debilitating, demoralizing. And I've found that our tests show our socioeconomic status. They don't show much of anything else. And the people that live in higher affluent areas love those tests because they make their kids look great on those tests, and the kids that don't are failing. And it's just a racket to demolish the public ed system with that tool. And Shannon, you said it. They have turned the state testing into weapons, and they're very urgent about it now. Now it's on a steam train. And Jack,
Well, I didn't say that. Sharon said
oh,
it.
Sharon, I'm sorry, Shannon. I said Shannon. I meant Sharon. Sorry, Sharon. I didn't give you the credit.
Okay.
Good. It is. They are weapons, I believe. What do you think, Jack?
Well, it sounds like you all had a lovely conversation while I was gone. Sorry about that. At least I warned you that the internet was starting to be spotty. I'm joining from my phone now.
Oh, gosh.
All I was trying to say was that the scholarship, if you look at it, suggests actually that public schools outperform private schools in the aggregate. When you do a fair apples to apples comparison. If you all want to dig into that, you can look at work by Chris Lubienski, who's at Indiana University. And if you want to look at the performance of schools that receive private school vouchers, those tend to, on aggregate, be pretty abysmal, because the study by Chris Lubienski, he wrote a book called The Public School Advantage. That study had a much larger sample of private schools that they had test scores for that they could compare against public schools. Whereas private schools that go after public dollars in the form of vouchers tend to be lower performing, struggling schools that need public subsidies in order to survive. These are schools, mind you, that unlike their public counterparts, do not have to adhere to state standards. And, we can critique state standards, but they do establish a floor, that do not have to hire licensed teachers, which means that 99% of educators have not received any form of training whatsoever in those schools, and that are not publicly governed, and therefore, can get away with practices that would simply be unacceptable in public schools. And if you're interested in some of that scholarship, Josh Cowan has been writing very frequently for the public about the performance of private schools receiving publicly funded vouchers.
Yeah, he's a
Okay,
great.
where do charter schools fit into all this? Because on one hand, they're not public schools. I mean, they're not private schools. How do those fit in? I've toured some charter schools. My kids went to public school, and I'm very happy about that. And my grandchildren are going to public schools, so I'm real happy about that. But the charter schools I've toured were fantastic. So help me out here with where they stand in this whole discussion.
So charter schools are publicly funded and privately managed. So they're really kind of in between the private voucher programs we've been talking about and public schools. And you're right, particularly in urban areas, we have some charter schools that have been amazing. And, the original concept in the 90s was that, these were going to be laboratories of innovation that basically teachers and communities could try out different ideas, and then those ideas would go back to be adopted in the public system. But that really wasn't what happened. Instead, what you have in Texas, although supersized as everything in Texas is, I'm thinking about a charter school chain like the Idea schools, where there's also a lot of money to be made. Suddenly there's a plane, there are tickets to sporting events. And so now I think even people who were very pro charter school will look back and say, we didn't quite realize how much the profit motive was going to become a problem with these schools. And a big part of the reason why charter schools have expanded the way that they did was that there was strong bipartisan support for them. Well, now that situation is getting more complicated because in states like Texas, there's a push to redefine charter schools as private. Texas is one of a number of states that tried to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court that would say this, basically, that charter schools are private, therefore they are exempt from certain constitutional protections and requirements. So you can kind of see how those tea leaves might shake out in the not too distant future. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Jack.
No, other than that, we talked about the neoliberal consensus earlier, and charter schools are a great example of that, where the idea was that these schools could run a bit more like businesses than traditional public schools, that you would establish performance thresholds that those charters would need to meet. Those, of course, were based entirely on student standardized test scores. And that you would provide them with greater autonomy, right? That you wouldn't tell them how to get results, but that you would insist on those results. And the bipartisan consensus meant that you had George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama all giving full-throated support to charter schools for a long time. And I'll say one more thing about this, which is that Americans have never had any taste for vouchers, but charters, in as much as they remained public and open to all students, in as much as they were overseen by, publicly elected officials of some sort, felt that that was something more acceptable, but that voucher supporters used charter schools as a way of prying open the door towards voucher programs through a kind of salesmanship around choice. So we've been hearing about school choice now for 3 decades, and it is no accident that shortly after the era of charter schools, we find ourselves in the era of private school vouchers, because supporters of vouchers were very shrewd in using the political moment to sell Americans on a different way of thinking about schools. Schools are not something we do together as communities for each other, right? Schools are places for building your human capital that families decide upon via choice in a free market. And that's a very different vision. And that's a vision that accords more with private school vouchers. Hey, the benefit of school accrues solely to you, the student, and your family ought to be the entity that makes a decision about where you go to school, as opposed to, again, thinking about school as an extension of community, as one of the ways we enact public life in this country and act as citizens to shape our living conditions, political, social, economic, and otherwise.
Okay, I'm sorry, and tell me if I'm dominating, but this voucher thing, what does that look like? So let's say I move into Texas and the voucher's available to go to a private school. Does it pay for the entire tuition? And does the private school offer transportation to their school? Do they offer, I'm going to have to drive my kids every day to this school? So I'm just curious, help me out with what these vouchers would look like.
So
Well,
I
go
would
ahead.
really encourage you to just spend even 15 minutes looking at what's happening in states that already have these programs. So just today, I saw a story from Oklahoma, and it said parents thought that vouchers would pay the cost of their tuition. Instead, the private school raised tuition. This is just today, right? We're seeing this happen in state after state. And all of the questions that you just asked about, transportation, the answer is no, right? The most straightforward way to describe what a program like this is really about is school's choice. That it's up to the school to decide whether you get to go there, how much above the voucher they want to charge. Another story I saw out of Ohio today, that a lot of religious schools are now requiring parents to apply for vouchers. And so it just, it shows you, it's the dynamic that Jack was describing, that it's a way of keeping schools afloat, while at the same time selecting a student body that public school couldn't do and also shouldn't want to do.
And there's one more important thing to add here, which is that the way that private school vouchers are constructed, and this may be unavoidable in private school vouchers, is that they exacerbate inequality. So imagine that a private school voucher is only sometimes going to cover the full cost of tuition. That's going to be a massive subsidy to families that were already choosing to send their children to private schools. And what we've seen is that when vouchers are introduced, the vast majority of users are people who never enrolled their kids in public schools in the first place. And it just pulls money out of the treasury and puts it in the pockets of well-to-do families who already could afford private school tuition. Meanwhile, it creates a market for schools that often are fly-by-night operations to suddenly get their hands in the public treasury by claiming to be able to educate young people. And so those are the young people whose families would not be able to afford paying tuition above the value of the voucher, who end up getting a worse education, substantially worse than they would have received in the public education system, not only because they're going to a fly-by-night school, but also because they're going to more segregated schools now as a result. So I think it's really important to keep our eyes on the issue of equitable treatment, because however we feel about that word equity, there's a way of framing it for our friends, neighbors, and even those we disagree with, so that they will understand that none of us want to live in a world where kids have radically different opportunities merely because of the circumstances that they were born in.
I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. And I would just really, honestly, if whatever you know or don't know, this little guy right here will help tremendously. It'll give you words to use when you approach people that may not have something in common with you, but may actually love their public schools. In Texas, they had a horrible poll that was put out the other day from a horrible human being out of Rice University that decided to say, all with some bad data, reported badly, that all Texans want vouchers now, or, I don't remember what the exact amount of percent. I just rolled my eyes. There's no way that's true. And we do know that regardless of party, regardless of political party, across party lines, people in Texas love their local public schools. They just maybe don't love the one over there or the one in your district or whatever, but we've got each other pointing at each other. I mean, it is just we have a lot of work to do, grandparents and parents. And so I'm just thrilled that Jack and Jennifer could join us today. And I'm thrilled that we've gotten the opportunity at Grandparents to have another resource. Like I said at the beginning, their Have You Heard podcast is fantastic. And, they banter back and forth, and it's just so fun. And they just talk deep thoughts, and Jennifer clarifies some of the big words that Jack uses so people understand. And it's wonderful. So I would just really encourage everybody, if you listen to a podcast, that's the one to listen to on public education. And that's the work that we're doing here tonight. Jack and Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us in Texas tonight from your East Coast time zone. I'm sorry you're hot, Jack. I was hoping because you were freezing, you might cool off a little bit. I guess that didn't happen. Your book is a remarkable gift to our public schools, and you are both warriors and heroes for the work that you do. So we just appreciate you so much. And to everybody on the call or on the Zoom and everybody watching the recording, we just want to thank you all for being here. The recording of this event again will be posted on our YouTube channel and emailed to all the participants tonight. Let me just share a quick story about how Grandparents for Texas Public Schools came to be. It was a summer of 2023, just a little over a year ago, when a few concerned Texas grandparents noticed that their grandkids' schools were under threat of losing funding by the state legislature. The talk of implementing vouchers was getting louder, and these parents knew they couldn't just sit by and watch. That's when our organization was born. We jumped into action, advocating during special legislative sessions to make it clear that grandparents won't tolerate attacks on our grandkids' public schools, and we didn't stop there. This year, we've testified twice before the State Board of Education and their curriculum and their charters and all that. And just this week at the House Pub Ed Committee meeting, we testified. We've also been busy writing postcards, making sure our legislators know our grandkids and their neighborhood public schools have our full support. But our work isn't done, and we need your help. We'd love for you to join us, or even recruit your own parents to join us if you're a parent. And, you know, grandparents vote. They have a little more time on their hands in a lot of cases. And believe me, the legislators are listening to what we have to say. Before we wrap up, I want to point out something important. The little pesky donate button on our website our website is all one word, grandparentsforpublicschools.org. We are planning to order copies of Education Wars book, and with an extra donation, we'll send you a copy. This book is only 156 pages long, but it's powerful, and it needs to be in the hands of every grandparent. Imagine the conversations it could spark in local diners, coffee shops, and anywhere parents and grandparents gather. Let's keep this movement going and make sure our voices are heard. Thank you again for your support tonight, and thanks again to Jennifer and Jack. And we're so happy that you were here, and I know I learned a lot, and I could see some wheels turning in some of our participants here, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having us, but thanks especially for all that you do. And I know I'm going to tell everyone who I talk to about this group and encourage them to start their own groups. And I hope that you don't mind if I send them on to you for some Texas-sized advice.
Excellent. That would be great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and stay cool, and stay cool, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you. Good